So we are about to talk about evolution today, which is big idea one. I've broken down our notes into several different sections, and this is the first one. We're going to talk about descent with modification and Darwin and some of his ideas. So first, let's talk about those connections that we like to make between one big idea and the next. And that is the study of evolution is supported by evidence. Now we have many different disciplines, including DNA technology. Okay, so that's going to be our big idea 3 with DNA. So I put this picture or these pictures on here because I want you to just take a minute and see if you can find the caterpillars in each one of these pictures. Yes, there are caterpillars in each picture. So take a minute, look at them, see if you can identify each one. Okay, and think about this organism and what that means. This organism is perfectly suited to its environment. There is no chance or very little chance that this organism is going to get picked off by a bird or another predator because it's very hard to see them unless, of course, they move, right? So this organism is perfectly suited to its environment. So let's talk about Darwin and how his ideas came about and a little bit about history. Okay, so the first person that we should talk about is Aristotle with his Scala Natura, which he thought that species were fixed and unchanging. The amount of species that were always there, and that's what was going to be there. Okay, because he believed that species were individually designed by a creator. This was in like the 300 BCs. Then we skip many, many, many years to Carolus Linnaeus, who was actually born Carol Linnaeus and then changed his name because he wanted it to sound more scientific, and he's the one who came up with this. In the 1700s, he developed our binomial system. It's called binomial nomenclature, and it means two-word naming system. He apparently didn't like the names that Adam or whatever gave all of the organisms. So he decided to come up with his own. But he did still model this off of a pattern of creation so that organisms were there. But what he did was made it able for us, no matter what language we spoke, no matter where we were, if we were talking about a certain organism, if we used its scientific name, we all knew which organism we were talking about. And we didn't have to worry about language barriers or about just even regional differences between what we call something. Okay. And then we have Darwin, who said that organisms should be grouped based on evolutionary descent. He went along with Linnaeus, but not based on patterns of creation, but based on evolutionary descent. So briefly, change over time. You know what fossils are. They're found in sedimentary rock layers, which we call strata or stratum for singular. And they can give us ideas of organisms that were living at that time. So if we can date the rocks, we can date that layer, we can know what organisms were available at that time. There are missing ones because soft-body animals don't normally make fossils, so we don't get to see everything, but we do get an idea. Okay. Along comes Cuvier, Georges Cuvier, back in the 1700s, early 1800s, and he was a paleontologist. He believed in creation also, but he said that extinctions were the common occurrence, that we saw these animals coming and going. So there was an extinction, so we lost animals, and then the populations came back, so then we saw animals or animals that were just slightly different because of that catastrophic event, like a flood. Then we have Hutton. He was about the same time as Cuvier. He was a geologist, but he actually proposed that Earth's formations were gradually formed. Okay. He said that all of the things that we see were formed over many, many, many years through a slow process. Lyell was another geologist around the same time, a little bit later than Hutton, who added to that and said that the processes are still occurring today. So Darwin, he was influenced by both Hutton and Lyell's ideas of this changing Earth and the slowly changing Earth. And because of that, he accepted the idea that the Earth must be much older than what was the widely accepted age of a few thousand years. He then reasoned that there must be a similarly slow and subtle process that could produce this biological change that we were seeing. But Darwin was not the first one to have this idea. So let's talk about Lamarck. Lamarck was one of the first to propose a mechanism, so a way, for how life can change over time. His name was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Say that's kind of fun, right? He was alive from 1744 to 1829, which was when he was doing most of his work. And he did have this recognition that there was an evolutionary change that could explain patterns that we saw in fossils and organisms and their suitedness or suitability to their environments. He came up with his hypothesis in 1809, and that's the year that Darwin was born. He came up with his hypothesis by comparing species that he saw to fossils, and he found lines of descent, so that organisms seem to be related. He had two principles. Sorry about that. The first principle was use and disuse. So Lamarck said that body parts that were used a lot would become larger, longer, stronger, like the giraffe neck. So the giraffe would stretch his neck, used it a lot, therefore it became a larger part of the giraffe's body. Okay. With that use and disuse then, body parts that are not used would tend to deteriorate and go away. And again, he was looking at the fossil record trying to figure this out. His second principle was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay, so that would mean that these organisms had these body parts that were used or disused, and they would pass these modifications on to their offspring. So he thought that evolution would happen because organisms had an innate drive to become more complex. But we have shown that his idea was not true. He's kind of, made fun of for that. But in all, he was one of the first to come up with an idea and tried to propose how evolution could happen, or how we could see all of these different organisms that we saw. Okay, now we're on to Darwin. Darwin was born in 1809, the same year that Lamarck put out his hypothesis on acquired characteristics, and he lived until 1882. He loved nature, and especially botany, for those of you who do like plants. I know some of you don't. But he was born to a physician, and that's what he wanted his son to do. But Darwin was not cut out for that, and he knew that. He found medicine boring and surgery horrifying. So he decided to become a clergyman. That didn't work out for him either. So while he was at school at Cambridge, he actually was able to get in good with one of the professors, who got him a ride on a ship called the Beagle, where he would become their naturalist. Okay? So he was looking for patterns and things in nature, taking many samples, and spent lots and lots of time on this boat, drawing, observing, collecting thousands of plants and animals. What Darwin noticed or noted was that organisms seemed to be suited or fit to their environments. No matter where they traveled on the Beagle, there seemed to be organisms in that particular area that had just the right traits for living in that area. And he also noticed that similar plants and animals lived in similar environments. animals that he would find in the temperate regions of one area were the same as animals that he would find in the temperate regions of another area, but differed from animals that lived in drier areas. So Darwin's focus was on adaptations. Now, we use the word adaptations wrong all the time. We say, like, I adapted to the weather, or I'm becoming adapted to the weather. But a true biological adaptation is something that is inherited. So it's not something that you can force yourself to do. Okay, so you inherit some sort of trait or characteristic that helps you to be able to survive and ultimately reproduce in your environment. The point of everything, of all life, is to reproduce and pass your traits on to the next generation. So Darwin said that those adaptations that organisms have come through natural selection. Some individuals with certain traits will survive, they will reproduce, and they'll pass on those traits, while other organisms won't. A guy named Alfred Wallace, who's also a scientist, came to the same conclusions, and he actually sent Darwin his paper, his publication, and asked Darwin to read over it. And Darwin had already written his book and was almost done with it, but was afraid to submit it because he knew the the implications it would have with the whole community, being that he was basically going against religion. And that was a time in our history where we were very religious people and believed in creation and not evolution. So Darwin hesitated. But he did go ahead and publish his idea 1 year later. And Wallace actually, for once, a scientist took the back seat and said, hey, he was the one who had a more fully developed idea. He should get credit for this. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so then we have Darwin's book. It was called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, but most people just know it, The Origin of Species. This gets to his main concept of descent with modification. So the word evolution is not used in his book at all. As a matter of fact, it only appears at the very last word when he says evolved, is the last word of his book. Okay, so he's going to use this idea of descent with modification. What he brings about in his book the idea of the unity in life, that many different organisms share many different characteristics, or many of the same characteristics. And he attributes this to a remote ancestor that all organisms must have had way back in time. He says that various and diverse modifications, so changes, were made and accumulated based on different environments. And again, that's not the organism deciding to, it was whatever was suited to that environment that helped them survive and have offspring that survive and reproduce. He shows the history of life as being a tree with multiple branches, and that branching process and extinction could help explain gaps in related organisms. Okay, so artificial and natural selection. In his book, to persuade his audience, because he wanted to win people over to what he was saying, Darwin gave examples of selective breeding that humans had been doing for hundreds of years with plants and animals, that choosing the characteristics that they liked and making that plant or animal breed to make more. Okay, so in that, he also showed that crops, livestock, and the pets that they were keeping at that time had little resemblance to their wild ancestors. So his argument was that if we can do this, if humans can make this happen, then this similar process can happen in nature. Okay, so what we have here is a cladogram, or what we could think of as a phylogeny. So it's a evolutionary history, and this one is of the 3 different kinds of elephants that we see. So we're going all the way back. We're looking at all of these different kinds of organisms that we've seen through time, with down here the 3 current elephants. Okay, so some of these are still around, some of them are extinct. Okay. Here, these 2 would have been more closely related than those, or then these, okay? But this would have been the common ancestor, or shared a common ancestor with this Moetherium, okay? And then all the way back here is where the very common ancestor would have been. And we'll do a lot of these. We'll talk about these. We'll go through them. So if you don't understand it right away, that's okay. But just know that here's the common ancestor, and then everything branches out from there. Okay, so Darwin had a couple different observations and inferences that we're going to discuss. And here are his two observations. First, there is variance or differences within a population in the traits that they can inherit. There's brown hair and blonde hair, okay? There's black fur and white fur. Observation 2 was that species can produce more offspring than the environment can support. So some fail, they die. They don't survive long enough to reproduce. They can't get enough food. They're taken over by disease, famine. Those ideas came from an economist, Thomas Malthus, who said that disease, war, and famine were necessary to regulate our population. So from those two observations, Darwin made two inferences. One is that individuals with inherited traits that give them a better chance of surviving and reproducing will, just by nature, leave more offspring because they have a better, they're better suited to their environment. And the other inference was that this unequalness between organisms and the unequal ability of one organism to survive over the other leads to an accumulation of favored traits over time. Okay, so finally, in summary, individuals do not evolve. Natural selection works on populations and interactions between the organisms and their environment. Traits that are favorable in one environment may not be favorable in another environment or in another time in our history, okay? And natural selection can only amplify or diminish heritable traits, things that they get from their parents that differ between individuals. So an individual with a population, with all of the same traits where everybody is identical will not evolve because there is no difference. They will either thrive or they'll all die because there's no differences. Okay, so hopefully you've got a little bit more of a basic understanding of the process of natural selection and how the history of evolution theory came about. And we will be moving on to our next set will be on the evidence for evolution. Have a great day. Thanks.